E mua lava no tāru wei a whei, ma o whatulou pa ia, ma malu a whia. A whio pa ia I hau kāinga, a whio pa ia I mana whenua, a whio pa ia I tangata whenua, a whio pa ia I tangata tomotu. Tulou lawa. Turn on. I pay honour and respect to hau kāinga, mana whenua, to the ancestors that are amongst us, to the peoples of this land, to all of you who are present, and those that are amongst us. I pay tribute. I actually, in my launga, I talk about the sacredness of space and how important that, in growing up as I'm Samoan, I'm of Samoan parents. I am the ancestor Usufono I Manu, Ahora Matai, from Solotai in Lauli'i. I am the ancestor Beseta, just the Matai in Port Pua in Savai, which is my te tau o tōku pāpa. And I feel so honoured to be here. I feel so blessed. Where's that header gone? And I just want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge being the Samoan in the room, of course. But like my history or my background or my upbringing has been in Tāmaki. I was born in Tāmaki, Makaurau, raised in Greyland, Ponsonby. My parents came over in the 50s, late 50s, 60s. And my father was this church minister. He was known as the godfather of PIC churches. And so I'm a daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and his name is, he's Leo Te, he's Betty Sio. My mother is Rosalina. I also have Atilie and Carrie Melesia, who also raised me, and we acknowledge as our parents. I also had the privilege of actually being the child of Ma and Pa Hawk, the bro over here. And I think the history is really important. I went to Auckland Girls Grammar School. I met all these Māoris. Miriama Rauhihi Ness was brought into the school to look after all us. I can't remember what they called us. Well, they couldn't handle us. And so I met Miriama Rauhihi Ness. Sharon came to school, and I think I'd just come into the senior year, and we kind of learnt about, a Kataraina Pipi was there, and she says to me, "Do you know Joe Hawke?" And I went, "Nah." And she goes, "Do you know about Bastion Point?" I went, "Nah." And she goes, "Oh, okay, well, that's Joe Hawke's daughter." I went, "Okay." Next minute, we're down Queen Street marching up. Next minute, we're up at Bastion Point. And these stories are really important. And they're important because these are the things that taught me about what it was to be here as a Samoan on Māori land and in the context of being on Ngāti Whātua land. And my learning continues. My support for Māori struggle continues. And I'm here to talk about ngā vaka o kāinga tapu. But in order to give it some context, I've worked in the area of ending violence against women and girls for like 40 years. I am really young. And it starts off, our parents, my father used to always kind of turn up to the wharf. When I was growing up, he'd go down to the wharf and he'd to meet the boats coming in from the islands. And he'd bring all these people home. And we'd be like, "Oh, who's this? Auntie, uncle, cousins." And they weren't. But actually, they were people that didn't actually have anywhere to land. They were coming here to find work, so as they could support their families back home. And so we had all these aunties and uncles come and stay with us until they could get on their feet and actually or find their whānau or their aina somewhere else in the country, usually Christchurch. As that down here was one of the places they would come to Auckland and to come here. So they had to stay in Auckland for months. I don't know why. Maybe there weren't any buses or things at the time. But also those stories, like I used to, this thing about how we care for each other, how we look after each other, how we built our villages here in Aotearoa. The churches became a site or became a place, became the village because actually we didn't have villages. We'd left our villages. Our parents left our homes to come here, to have us. They thought it was the place to come and find supports for their families back home. But also, we share histories of colonisation. And, we as we grew up, we didn't know all these stories. I've learnt them as I've got a bit older. And our people were exiled during our resistance movements. Our leaders were exiled to different parts of the world, New Zealand being one of those places. And tiny people looked after them, and they looked after our whānau who were coming back and forth. They would take them down, so they could visit with our people, and then they'd go back home. And I saw a carving somewhere down in Tūranga Waiwai, and I asked someone come up to me and they said, I said, they look like islanders. He goes, they are islanders. And started telling me the story about our connections. And my father used to tell me all these stories about, he'd say, everyone's from Samoa, right? Right? So I'd go to school and I'd say to my mates, you're all from Samoa, right? They'd be like, yeah, Betty, right? I said, no, my dad said you're all from Samoa. It's real. And, anyway, he'd be telling me all these stories, and one of them was, Betty, my dad said to me, that takatumu waka, that tree was found in Samoa. By now, my friends had given me such a hard time about all these stories I was sharing with them about how Samoa was so great, how I was so wonderful. Anyway, I'm telling the story, and I said to my dad, no, I'm not going to go and share that story. I don't think it's true, right? Anyway, years later, Megan Jo comes to me and she says, and kia ora to her, she says, Betty, do you know about the history of the takatumu waka? I says, nah. And she starts telling me, and I went, oh no. And she goes, what? I says, I told my father he was a liar. Anyway, Dad, I'm sorry for that. And so the work that we got into, I was at school, and a couple of young women come to me, and their uncle was a minister, and they had been abused by him, and they were just talking about it. And I was like, what do we need to, what can we do? What can we do for you? And they're like, no, we don't want to tell nobody. You can't tell anyone. You have to promise me that you ain't going to tell nobody. And I've sat with that all my life. Couldn't tell no one. And we were always faced, we knew this person, we knew the abuser, but we were never allowed to talk about it. We were never allowed to expose it. Meanwhile, I go to Wellington because I follow Katarana and Sharon everywhere. And they go to Wellington, so I go to Wellington, and there's Kiri, and there's all these, they're into youth work. And we're doing this work around abuse, like young people that have been abused. And I'm not doing the work, I'm just sitting there listening a lot, really. I'm quite young. And during this time, there's a hui that happens in Paraparaumu. Is it Paraparaumu? And it was with Anne Herkes. And it was coming together of all the, I think, rape crisis refugees and some of the Māori providers, yeah? I was the driver. And again, the only islander. But that was cool. But from this hui, Te Kākano Te Whānau was formed. So I just want to say kia ora to all of those that are here that had been part of Te Kākano o Te Whānau. I'm in the history book, by the way, of actually, it states that I convened a meeting for Te Kākano o Te Whānau. I don't actually remember doing that, but it must have been a job I was sent to do. But that was actually on behalf of all of these women that are here today and those who aren't. But I do want to acknowledge Te Kākano o Te Whānau. It was my introduction into doing this work, or actually a kind of follow on from what we were doing in Wellington. But the Pacific Island Women's Project was set up out from this hui. So I'm sitting there, the only islander, and you know, there's Kataraina Pipi, Meriana Pipman, there's Hini Wirangi, there's who else is there? There's quite a few women. Anyway, they're saying to me, come and sit with us, Betty. You're not going to sit with the Pākehās, come sit with us and be part of Te Kākano o Te Whānau. I have always been cared for. I've always been blessed in the spaces that I've been in. I've never been alone, even though I'd like to set up Pacific caucuses on my own. But I've never felt alone. And so this work that we got into around ending violence was so easy to get into. And it was so easy to get into because we knew how to look after each other. We knew how to care. And so in Wellington, I left Wellington, came to Auckland, and we'd set up this national organisation, but all of a sudden they wanted us to set up an incorporated society. Even though after we'd agreed that actually there'd be no strings attached to the way in which we did our work, but in order to receive any funding, we had to become incorporated. When I left Wellington, the organisation became an incorporated society, and it kind of went downhill from there. And and that's not us. Actually, what went downhill was that we were starting to be the compliance of it all. The stories of who we were had been changed. We didn't want. All of a sudden, we weren't. Our people didn't want to engage. We were avoiding the system. So when I came to Auckland, we set up Pacific Island. It's kind of a carry-on from Pacific Island Women's Project, and we set up Pacific Island Safety and Prevention Project. And the work is the same. We were doing work with women. And women would come to us and say, oh, Betty, someone needs to work with our men. And I was like, oh, no, we're a women's organisation. We don't work with men. Are you right? Terrible. No, Betty, someone needs to work with our men. They're getting charged. They're getting charged, they're going to court, and then they're going to prison. And then they're coming out of prison and nothing's changed. I'm not going to leave them. So someone needs to work with our men. Meanwhile, while he's in prison, we've lost our house. We can't feed our children. The breadwinner's gone. And our children are probably going to be taken from us. This is the stories that our women would be telling us. And it was such a common thing. You just expected that actually if family violence was involved, our kids were going to be taken. So we started, we were still in a women's organisation, and we had this bro come to us. His name was Osayasi Kupu. I acknowledge him, he's Tongan. And he comes and he says, sis, I want to come and do a placement with you. Bro, it's a women's organisation. We can't have men working here. Oh, come on, sis, I just heard you do a presentation and you talked about this and that. No, bro, we're a women's organisation. Anyway, he persisted over about 2 or 3 weeks. I ended up having to say yes because, the Tongan bro was kind of just in my ear. Anyway, he came. This was back in the early 90s, and he'd never left. And I want to thank him for persisting, because really we needed the men. And we needed the men because it was still, our kaupapa was still around actually around ending violence against women, but we did need someone working with the men. And our work with the men was, we had to kind of think about how we were going to do this work with men. And so men would come along. Legislation and the regulations didn't allow for us to have men and women in the same space. We found that really difficult, because actually part of the work was actually having to work with whānau for us. And so we broke a lot of rules. And we talked about this when we talked to the government, talked about how we had to be, what's the word? Not lie, but we lied. We had to be creative. We had to be creative about the way in which we reported. We had to be creative about the way we did the programs. And actually we didn't like having to be, we didn't like feeling like we were lying about something. But what we did know is that if we didn't do it this way, our way, that it wasn't going to have an outcome that was going to be good for these whānau, for these āinga. Anyway, I've gone right off my script. But what we did was that we fought for the right to be able to do this work in this way. Further on, we would do things like, so we started working with men, and then there was this whole process around Pole 400s. Some of these, I don't know what they're called now. At the time, they were Pole 400s, so that was a police call-out. And and the police call-out, you know, we'd go to, our job was to go and visit these whānau and these āinga and assess the woman, not the men, not children, assess the woman, and then to make sure she was safe, and then offer up support. We'd send out our crew, and they'd come back and about, you know, like they weren't seeing anyone. And I was like, what's happening? And they'd be saying to us, oh, well, there's no one home, right? They're going up between 9 and 5. Well, how come? Well, they're working, and the children are at school, right? So what would happen was that we had to change the way in which we worked. People would start work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And, you know, like up to now, the story had been our people weren't engaging, they were avoiding conversations. And remember, this is just after maybe a domestic violence occurrence. And so we had to change the story about who we were and what we were about, and it was nothing about that at all. Ngā vaka o kāinga tapu came about because we had the support, and we had the support of Dame Tariana Turia. I just want to acknowledge her as well. At the time, could see, because we would say to her, you know, this is what we're doing, and but we can't do it, and we're not allowed to through pieces of legislation and regulations. How are we able to, you know, can you support us to be able to do this work so that we could get the outcomes? And so she listened to us, and she says, well, what would you like to do? And I says, the conceptual frameworks came up. Now, there was a group in 2002 or early 2000 of Māori task force. It had Tāmati Kruger, Mirena Pittman, Di Grinnell, and a whole lot of people, Māori, that started this conversation around frameworks, a Māori framework. And we looked at it and thought, actually, we need something like that for Pacific. And so that's what kind of pricked our minds around actually how we could develop a framework that actually we could use. And it was from our practice and our knowledge of who we are as Samoan, as Tongan, as Cook Islanders, as Niue, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Fiji. Is that 7? And it was these groups, what we did was we pulled these communities together. And the communities were made up of elders, of academics, of practitioners, and of just community people, our parents and young people. And we asked a question to them. I was part of the Samoan group. It was the Le Tōwha Mamao is our framework. And we asked the question, how are we going to address family violence in our community? And we started this series of conversations. And the conversations went from, you all know, we were during colonisation, we were colonised by the London Missionary Society. And so Christianity is a huge part of who our Samoan people are, right? It's very much part of their lives. And so we started these conversations, and the conversations would go, firstly it would be like churches would be the sites of where, you know, all the ministers, And I'd ask the question, well, hang on, what was it before Christianity? And we couldn't think, our people could not think before Christianity. And it wasn't until we started speaking in Samoan, and it was like, what was Whaasamoa? And it wasn't until we started having the conversation about Whaasamoa that we were able to have the conversations about pre-colonisation, about village structure, about accountability, about how we cared for each other. And so we were able to talk about our work that we were doing with men, with women, with ainga, and we were able to inform these conceptual frameworks. And so they're concepts like, when I talk about vā, there's concepts about vā whāroai. The vā whāroai concept is about sacredness or space. And so when we breach or when we violate or breach a tapu, there is a process by which to restore well-being or restore harmony. And Whaasamoa is about keeping everything harmonious, peaceful. I feel my voice lowering. And, usually people say to me, you should speak Samoan, Betty. And I go, why? And they go, because you speak softly when you speak Samoan. And you always sound like an angry woman when you speak English. So, and there's a thing about this, right? There's a thing about sacredness of space. And we grew up, we weren't allowed to share clothes with our brothers. We actually weren't allowed into our brothers' rooms, and we never understood why. Never ever understood why. We'd be like, here we go. Don't go into your brothers' rooms. Brothers don't go into your sisters' rooms. Don't share your clothes. And it hasn't been till I've kind of grown up a bit more and actually understand that actually we are sacred beings. And actually the sharing of those actually could be a breach of tapu. And actually, what is our risk? How do we restore the breaches? And actually, what do we create in terms of pathways? How do we create spaces where we can talk about restoration? And so that's what our groups became. We didn't talk about violence. We talked about actually what was happening for people. Men started talking amongst themselves in their groups. They had the solutions, they challenged each other, they had the tōwha mamao, and at the end they would leave. They would leave with their dignity intact. And that has been the purpose of actually creating these frameworks, that we can actually start changing the stories that have been so negative about us. And they have. We have been able to tell the stories of about, I don't know, what do you call it? Revolutionary love, I don't know, alofa. About alofa, about whaiā, about vā whāroai. We have been able to, we have covenants that exist between brother and sister. And it's the brother's job to ensure the well-being of his sister at all costs. Even though the relationships are equal, at the end of the day, it's the brother's job to ensure the safety of his sister. And these are not just brother and sister, this is men and women relationships and spaces. There are covenants in terms of elders and young people. And so, the frameworks again have been given us the ability to have conversations. Every time I used to ask as a younger kid, you didn't tell me about this, how come this happened? Why do you want to know? Would be the answer. And I think it's so important that we share, that we share our stories, and I'm really grateful, the pūrākau, in like the things that I have been able to draw upon in terms of being amongst whānau here, The other thing is, if I know myself and I'm strong in who I am and who I know to be, then I can be that for Indigenous Māori here. there is no question. I am not fearful of anything. I stand in my space and in the know of who I am, and in that sacredness. And, you know, the other thing is that when anyone walks in the room, we get told, anyone that walks in the room, just assume that they are matai. Assume. So, you know, and that's how you talk with them, that's how you engage. It doesn't matter what they've done, or, you know, that this is how you have the engagement. And I think those things are beautiful. And I think they're encouraging. And I look forward to continuing to have these conversations. You know, being in these spaces for me, I feel so honoured and thankful and grateful. The other thing about this, you know, like this thing in terms of state violence, we don't have control over how we get treated by the state. You know, anything that we do, and I've heard this throughout the last couple of days, anything that's going to work for us is going to be brought down somehow. I think one of the biggest mistakes we ever made at the project was that we said yes to taking their funding. We were working without their funding way before that. And anyway, I'm not the CEO of the project anymore. but you know, I am part of the project tainga, and I want to acknowledge all of that. You know, sorry, can I just say another thing? One of the things that we were able to do, and I just want to acknowledge Kitty, there was a action research that happened, and it was to find out what we were doing at the project. Anyway, it was going to be with the men. The men's groups, and all the women, all their partners turned up, all the children turned up, so they had to talk to everyone, and and all these young kids. Anyway, they started telling their stories, because, you know, people would say, "What are you doing differently, Betty?" The woman would say, "What are you doing differently?" I'm like, "We're not doing anything differently." And these kids and the woman would tell the stories about what had changed, about how men were being more present at home, taking the kids out. The kids would talk about their dads. And so that was a measure. You know, if we want to measure anything, let's talk to the people who have been affected. Let's talk to the women and children, and they will tell us what it is that's happened. These men had been going to Palangi programs, and they'd sat through 20 weeks of a program and didn't understand a thing that was being said to them. So, like, the other thing about reo and language, and the languaging of, is really important as well. Those are the things that have been key to our well-being, to us becoming well. Anyway, I didn't use my phone at all. But thank you. I think, just in terms of ngā vaka o kāiga tapu, which are the seven, you know, there were seven groups, Pacific ethnic groups that came together, and they were those groups that I talked about: Kukiairani, Fiji, Niue, Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, Tokelau. And I think recently Kiribati have also set up their framework. And I'm right, Leonie's right. We talked about how come Aotearoa didn't have a framework. And so you know, this is, I'm really looking forward to what comes out of this for that. You know, our people we're so caught up in this funder-driven kind of state that we will be silent because we don't want to lose our funding. Or we'll be silent because we don't want to lose our children. Or we'll be silent because actually someone's going to come for us if we're not silent. I just, you know, my experiences around some of this have been so in my face that I actually, I acknowledge, and I want to acknowledge my Māori sisters for kind of taking me under your wing and not being fearful of the state. I love it. Anyway, I don't know how long have I gone for? Only like 20 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had lots of stories to tell. Actually, I'm going to tell a story. When I was in Wellington, I was like 19 years old. And this is before I knew anything, you know, like we were just doing what we knew, thought we knew. I thought I knew a lot when I was 19. And a young girl had come to us and she had been hit by her dad. So we were, we'll go to the home, speak to the father, I'll be all right, right? Anyway, knock on the door and this fella comes out and he goes, hello? I said, I'm looking for Mr. So-and-so. Why? Oh, and then we start telling the story. No thought about what would happen to this girl. No thought about actually what this was for him. He goes, one moment, anyway. He takes off and he comes back and he's got a machete. And we start running. I could run when I was 19. We're out running down the road and I'm thinking, the lesson, you know, like really, the lesson learned was that actually someone's life was at stake here. Actually quite a few lives. And we hadn't thought through what the consequences may have been in the way in which we attend. And I tell the story because part of the work has to be about how we hold ourselves accountable. The stories are about also how we, when we know we have not done right, then we need to take that on and actually change. And that was also part of the work that we did as an organisation, was that we needed to do the work on ourselves first and foremost. And so it didn't matter that we were maybe closed down and we had to move on. Our work continues outside of that. You know, our work continues with our people, with our whānau, with our children, with our tamariki, you know, like, and that's been the beauty of all of this, is that we continue our knowledge and our presence in Māori struggle and our support for that was also part of our work. You know, it started becoming an issue when I started taking all our workers to, we went to Samoa, because I thought actually it'd be a good place to be to learn, right? Our place of learning. And I get a call from the funder asking, oh, we hear you're in Samoa. Mm-hmm. Oh, you didn't tell us. I didn't know I had to tell anyone that I was going to Samoa. And I remember having this conversation and thinking, you know, this is why we do need to change the way we do the work, but also have a thinking around what happens when we actually take on particular funding in a particular way, but also remembering how the state can be with us. Anyway, I learnt all these, I had all these words that I said, which part of it was actually it's none of your business that we're actually in Samoa. And is the real question, have we used your money to get here? And you know, and like, you know, like having to be really clear about actually, well, no. But it forms a, what is it? It forms a, when we do things outside of the norm or outside the ordinary or what people might think is we should be doing, it sets us up. But we were, you know, you have to be courageous in doing this work. Yeah, and I'm proud of some of the things that we actually decided to do. I think I'll end there for now. Thank you very much.
Good. before Betty leaves the stage, I'm sure there's a question out there. Ana, kei te tuwhera mō ngā pātai.
I don't have a question. I just want to confirm that Betty has been a strong part of all of our movements, and she's well known amongst our people as being a strong ally. And I think you're a really great example of what an ally can be, Betty. And the way that you support and you know where you're walking and you know your lane. Oh, sorry, not your lane, but you know where the pool is as opposed to the sea. and Betty's work, your kōrero today, Betty, reminds me of what practice looks like after learning about what are the wrong things to do over the years. And by learning by practice and by learning by making mistakes. And from your own mother and father as well. So, you know, tēnā koe, Betty, just the mihi. Kia ora.
Malo, malo kiri.
Oh, kia ora, Betty. Thank you for your kōrero today. I wondered we too have also been thinking at times about where the funding comes from. And in fact have sometimes turned down funding because of the hooks that come with it. I wondered, have there been some learnings from the funding that you have received or not received elsewhere that perhaps you could share with us, or has there been more kōrero that you've had with your kaimahi in terms of that space?
Sorry, I'm not actually in that space anymore, but you know, even in the commissioning space, I suppose, for how we experienced it, I suppose, at the time as an organisation, that was the word that you used, Hera. We were approved agencies. Approved agencies. You know, it didn't feel any different at all. And it was, you know, the compliance remained the same. I mean, and though the conversations we had around, say, whānau water were going to be different, and we didn't experience that in any way. This is in terms of the Pacific space anyway. You know, prior to becoming, we were a whānau water provider, but prior to becoming that, and kind of, you know, we were doing the same work. We were doing the work. And we continued to do the work over and above of what was expected of us, because actually it wasn't actually about the funding. It was actually about being there and providing supports for our ainga and community. And so, you know, in the stories I talk about in terms of our parents, that we continued that legacy. So, like, you know, funding is if anything, became more than a hook. It became the reason why they closed us down, actually. And, you know, like, that's the state. And actually it's the state hook of their control of us. Which is why I say the worst thing we did was actually take the funding. We would have been left alone otherwise.
Thank you.
Come on.